Why hasn't there been a socialist revolution in Britain? One of the main questions socialists encounter is this: if socialism is such a good idea, why haven't we achieved it yet? Or similarly, if the working class wanted socialism, don't you think we'd have it by now? These are reasonable questions that we must take seriously. The fact is, there is no easy or obvious answer to these questions. To properly understand why we haven't achieved socialism, it's vital to take into account the main contributing factors and look at examples of working class movements that have failed, those that have succeeded, and why. Through these lessons, we'll be far better equipped to ensure a socialist transformation. Most movements of the oppressed end in defeat. Is this because our task is insurmountable? Is this because we cannot topple dictatorships nor organize society ourselves? Absolutely not. As history has demonstrated time and time again, we have the potential to do all of this. In some ways, the challenge of socialist revolution could be boiled down to what Malcolm X said: we are not outnumbered, we are out-organized. However, there are several fundamental critical factors to consider, such as the role of consciousness, objective conditions in historical context, and the subjective factor, essentially leadership, the role of the individual. These factors all play a pivotal role in the success of movements and whether socialism is achieved or not. Another very common counter-argument and question socialists receive is this: don't you think the ruling class are too powerful and sophisticated to topple? What about their overwhelming fight-back capability? There is no dictatorship historically that has been so strong that it cannot be toppled. There has been no empire powerful enough, no ruler that's brutal enough to prevent revolutions, from Assad to the British Empire. All methods of rule have limits, and by far the most powerful force on earth is the mobilized working class majority. This is why in many revolutionary movements, the sitting army and government quickly capitulates and runs when the people start to mobilize in a revolutionary way. This is due to the overwhelming force of the oppressed majority, such as in Bangladesh last year, and indeed, this is how a peaceful revolution can be achieved. So we can categorically say our task of socialist revolution is possible. However, without sufficient development of conditions and subsequently consciousness, and without sufficient revolutionary theory and leadership, socialism is extremely unlikely or even impossible. So let's talk about the aspect of consciousness. Let's get into the detail on these key factors, starting with another common question. If you're right about socialism being a good idea and revolutions being inevitable, why isn't everyone demanding socialism right now? In some ways, the greatest tool the ruling class has is the human psyche. Our psychology, due to evolutionary reasons, is conservative, habitual, and generally reluctant and fearful of change. This is why we usually take the path of least resistance, and why changes in consciousness tend to lag behind events. We are typically, in our everyday lives, bound by routine, by a kind of inertia, to keep playing our parts without revolting. It takes a build-up of contradictions and experiences alongside profound shocks to dispel old illusions and habits, and to force us to get organized and fight. We are all part of this process, compelled to be here by our experiences of capitalism. People can be vaguely aware that the system isn't working and is unfair for decades. However, how we understand and feel about this unfairness can drastically alter through the course of events, from day to day, hour to hour. In short, people will only cease to be in a subordinate routine when they are compelled to by conditions. Despite the conservative nature of the human psyche, a revolutionary consciousness is undoubtedly developing, and illusions maintained for decades or even centuries are rapidly crumbling due to events, and fundamentally, economic decline. When a socio-economic system is on the rise, when it is developing and opening up new horizons, it creates a general psychology of hope. This is why, not so long ago, it was very common that people were excited for the future and thought everyone was going to become middle class. We'd achieve world peace, and poverty and hunger would be phased out. This is what people seriously believed, that the system was working and things would only get better. The context of conditions plays a pivotal role in consciousness. Up until roughly a decade ago, there was general optimism in society, with strong faith in the capitalist system and institutions. Pillars of the state, such as police, judges, royals, plus the rich in general, have gone from being viewed as saviours and neutral arbiters to being viewed as either parasitic or self-serving scum, or both, by an ever-increasing majority. The lack of any sympathy for the millionaires who drowned in the submarine was an example of the rapid transformation in class consciousness. Alongside this, the widespread feelings of despair, anger, pessimism, fear, and confusion are all psychological symptoms of a system in decline, with discontent constantly accumulating. When people no longer think tomorrow will be better than yesterday, it's clear capitalism has ceased to play a progressive role, and its days are subsequently numbered. To quote Lenin, the old period of capitalism has been followed by a new epoch, comparatively more impetuous, full of abrupt changes, catastrophes, conflicts, an epoch that no longer appears to the toiling masses as horror without end, but as an end full of horrors. There has not been a revolutionary explosion yet, because the underlying contradictions have not built up enough pressure or found the weakest point to break through. Just like with a volcano, pressures build up under the surface for decades, hidden until finally erupting. The mood in society is rapidly radicalized. Everything that was stable is teetering. Everything that gave confidence now produces uncertainty. Consciousness is catching up with the events of 2008, Grenfell, imperialist wars, COVID, etc. The threshold to realizing capitalism and its representatives cannot be trusted, and are completely incapable of taking humanity forward, is quickly being reached, if not reached already by many. Currently the mood is one of searching for another option. The old way is dead to most. This is reflected in the abandoning of mainstream parties the world over. People thought in the early 1900s that we would be living in a futuristic utopia by now, where leisure and pleasure would be the majority of our existence, not alienating work that destroys the soul and body. This optimism was largely present right up until the 2008 crash. Since then, as capitalism has turned into its opposite, so has mass psychology. Optimism is replaced by pessimism, hope by despair. The psychology of the population today is deeply insecure and confused. Crucially, this accurately reflects the state of the economy. Here's a quote which speaks to how events and pressure affect consciousness, and how this can reach breaking point and rapidly transform. Before a revolution happens, it is perceived as impossible. After it happens, it is seen as having been inevitable. So now we're going to talk about the historical context in Britain. In order to understand the trajectory of British society, and whether we could see a socialist revolution here, it's important to give some historic and economic context. By the early 1900s, capitalism in Europe had expanded to the extent that the whole world was being divided by imperialist plunder and colonial occupations. Britain, like all imperialist nations at the time, was increasingly meeting the limits of growth, of economic and political boundaries. There were enormous increases in production, followed by enormous collapses, as the oppressed cannot afford to buy back all the goods that they are forced to produce, that were being produced at an ever faster rate, with proportionally less being spent on labour and more on machines, resulting in closures, layoffs, and ruin. The accumulation of such economic contradictions led to World War I and the Great Depression, with subsequent enormous revolutionary movements globally, including in Britain, which, like many nations, was greatly inspired by the Russian Revolution around this time. In fact, the British Army was forced to retreat from its invasion of the newly found Soviet Union due to widespread mutiny over solidarity with the Russian revolutionary workers. There was also, in the same period, the general strike in Britain, which with better leadership absolutely could have led to socialism. The same goes for the revolutionary movements in Spain, China, Germany, Austria, Hungary, and Italy, which all tragically failed, and the contradictions of capitalism were not resolved by World War I or World Revolution. This ultimately led to World War II, which created such enormous and unimaginable destruction that it actually created the basis for the post-war boom. The workers had enormous leverage as nobody else could rebuild Britain, along with the funding of cheap loans and profit from the colonies and imperialist plunder. The post-war boom led to a general dying down in revolutionary upheaval in Britain, with consciousness becoming increasingly optimistic, with futuristic and utopian ideas being in vogue. However, it wasn't long before the working class had rebuilt capitalist infrastructure, and as soon as the working class were no longer needed to rebuild Britain, they were back to being attacked and squeezed. The shrinking of the economy coincided with a shrinking of the British Empire, as domination became economically untenable due to worldwide revolts. This created a necessity to privatise, shrink the welfare state, and to increasingly balance the books off the back of the workers in Britain. Under capitalism, if you can't maintain growth, you've got to cut corners, and it's always the working class that's cut and squeezed when the rate of profit falls or when the economy isn't growing. A key feature of this period of decline following the post-war boom was the miners' strike, which very much still has a defeatist effect on the psychology of the older generation today. However, there was also the successful anti-poll tax movement that followed, where the working class said no more, and so militant was the fight back that Thatcher resigned, and instead there was a shift towards using credit to temporarily keep the class conflict suppressed. Now anyone could become a homeowner so long as you got a mortgage, and if your salary wasn't enough, you could freely use the newly deregulated credit card system. By 2004, most transactions were made through a credit card, with personal debt skyrocketing. This was all a desperate attempt to keep the profit flowing and the economy growing, to stretch the system beyond its limits. The influx of enormous cheap credit and debt alongside speculation methods in the market, compounded with the centuries-long contradictions of overproduction, market anarchy and falling rates of profit, all led to the 2008 crash. This had an enormous impact on consciousness. No longer did capitalism seem to be the end of history, the endlessly stable system of growth and increased prosperity that the leaders of the world promised. In fact, time and time again, we're burdened with inflation and real-time wage cuts through no fault of our own. We have no say in the system or decisions ultimately responsible for the sustained attacks on our quality of life. Something's got to give. Flowing from the crash was the Occupy movement, which was a sharp rejection of the ruling class and their destructive tendencies. This was a determined yet peaceful protest that went on for years, with sites significant to capital being occupied 24/7. Faith in the establishment continued to diminish through the 2010s due to the Great Austerity lie. I remember in 2010 when Cameron and Osborne got elected explicitly on the basis that they were going to temporarily implement austerity to balance the books. They said we would all be better off after tightening our belts for a short period. People believed them. However, as reality unfolded, so the Tories' reputation has diminished and diminished. This dissatisfaction and rejection of being taken for a ride, alongside the stark increases in inequality, led to the rise of Corbyn and a shift to the left and right in Britain. People were done with the austerity lie. They wanted and demanded investment. They no longer trust the respectable men of Parliament, but want an outsider, someone authentic, who represents their interests. And these are the conditions that propelled Corbyn and Farage alike. For Corbyn, rather than any clever planning, it was actually an accident on his part that he became Labour leader. His election was very much a symptom of the crisis, and it was the crisis that suddenly made the ideas of socialism widely attractive, especially to the youth. The Brexit vote was also a rejection of the ruling class status quo. It was a big fuck you to the vast majority of establishment politicians in all parties telling the public what to do, alongside the majority of liberal press, television companies and big business, who all backed Remain. This approach of attempting to convince the public through a unified establishment position has become decreasingly effective. It's evident the establishment is no longer respected, it's disdained and distrusted, and the centre ground is collapsing. During the late 2010s and early 2020s, having seen that Parliament was unable to provide progress for society, and having learnt from the lessons of the Iraq War and Occupy movement, groups such as XR and Just Stop Oil pursued a far more radical and direct action approach. Again, out of frustration of the lack of any serious progress being made, institutional and societal racism, misogyny and abuse led to the Me Too and BLM movements, which generated huge traction. The oppressed can only tolerate so much for so long before they react out of desperation and organise in self-defence. The co-opting of these movements, plus the constant green and pink washing by privileged elites and big business, has also been a sharp lesson in class contradictions. It's become increasingly clear that the rich struggle separately to the majority of us, and the rich in general could never represent our interests, or be serious about addressing the issues we face, regardless of background, gender, or sexual orientation. COVID perhaps most of all proved to be a sharp lesson on the nature of capitalism. Never before has it been so clear that the ruling capitalist class is unable to provide safety, and will put profit before our lives if given the choice. They couldn't give a shit if we die in horrific isolated conditions, only about the destabilisation of profit, and profiting off the pandemic itself. Alongside this, the enormous Tory spending showed the government's hypocrisy. It turns out they can cough up the money to the working class when they choose to, despite the Tories always claiming such measures were impossible. And like with every bailout, we're shown more and more that capitalism needs a life support machine to continue. It cannot exist on its own merit. It must lean on the public to foot the bill and crush us ever more savagely in order to generate profit and growth. This increasing realization was also expressed in 2022-23 through the largest strike wave in decades. However, the leaders of the working class, especially trade union leaders, were shown to be inept, acting as barriers and brakes when the majority of union members wanted to go much further, up to and including general strike, especially public sector workers. Every union member I spoke to recognized we need to combine our efforts to prove how serious and desperate we are. As a result, trade union elections will likely continue to see turns to the left. People want more radical and militant leadership. Fearing further counterattacks from the working class, the Police, Crime and Sentencing and Courts Bill was put forward and eventually passed, only making clearer the nature of the state and our so-called democracy. Now simply protesting can be considered illegal, as and when the state chooses it. The mask has slipped off, and the ruling class has no way of putting it back on. Whether they double down on state oppression or try to appease us with minor concessions and platitudes, the outcome is the same. The resentment builds, and so does the desperation to fundamentally change society. The acceleration of the Palestinian genocide following October the 7th had and continues to have an explosive effect worldwide. Not only has the nature of imperialism become clearer, but the facade and ineptitude of capitalist laws and institutions, such as those of the UN and EU. Our own ruling class has especially shown its true colours. The majority of the British public oppose the genocide, yet our government supports it. Some democracy. In 2024, the assassination of the private healthcare CEO by Luigi Mangione made viscerally clear how people's consciousness has developed. Almost universally, from the well-off women in the Cotswolds to the bin workers in Glasgow, they all said the CEO had that coming, if not openly celebrating what was essentially a fight back. We are living in a revolutionary epoch, as is evident also by the massive uptake in revolutionary movements worldwide. Trump putting the richest man in the world in government, in charge of cuts to state spending no less, combined with Trump's unique ability to say the quiet parts out loud, has delivered an education worldwide on how capitalist democracy functions, and the nature of Western imperialism and so-called international law and order. The double standards in Ukraine, Palestine and Venezuela couldn't be more stark. Capitalism was sold to us as a fair system, whereby hard work is rewarded with a good quality of life for you and your family, a meritocratic liberal democracy. It is a very powerful sales pitch. However, the unravelling of this myth is equally powerful, as is the motivation that follows from this realization. Within economic and social upheavals are the seeds of social transformation. In Britain, this increasing change in consciousness is directly a result of the 2008 crash and every other major crisis since. These events have viscerally shaken and woken up people to the reality of capitalism. As such, I often meet people who are drawing some of the exact same conclusions as Marx, without ever even having read any Marxist text. There are countless ways in which capitalism contains within itself the seeds of its own destruction. The most critical is perhaps the unique role of the working class. Sooner or later we'll realize we don't need the bosses at all. They contribute nothing, and we can actually have a far better society without them. The working class want and need more, yet the system is unable to provide it. There is a way to deliver more and to actually alleviate the conditions of all oppressed. What's required now are the right ideas, approach, organisation and leadership. So now we'll discuss the subjective conscious factor, the role of leadership. A socialist revolution will not organically form, but must be planned. Without the correct ideas and understanding, socialism will not manifest. This is why study is nearly as important as practical work. Indeed, without revolutionary theory, there can be no successful revolutionary movement. Spontaneous mass movements reveal the enormous potential of the working class, but only as a potential. In the absence of able leadership, even the stormiest upheaval will not resolve the class contradictions, the Arab Spring being a prime example. Unlike a capitalist revolution, a socialist revolution requires the conscious movement of the working class, which must not only take the reins of state power into its hands, but abolish them, and also from the beginning assume conscious control of the productive forces. Through workers' control of industry, factories, infrastructure, healthcare, etc., it prepares the way for a democratically administered socialist society. The fact is, most revolutions fail. Some revolutions, such as the Spanish Revolutionary period of 31 to 37, presented many opportunities for the working class to take power. Others, such as the Russian Revolution, barely gave a single window of an opportunity. The decisive difference in both cases was leadership, the subjective factor. For example, in the Bangladesh Revolution last year, tragically, despite incredibly heroic efforts, the working class didn't take power, or therefore fundamentally transform society. This is particularly tragic because the same mistakes were made between 71 and 75, when the oppressed peoples of Bangladesh had many opportunities to take power. In both cases, what was missing was worthy leadership. Without a clear and correct revolutionary strategy, the movement reverted to giving power back to the ruling capitalist class, albeit to a different wing and section of the ruling class. Nepal was a very similar story also last year. The momentum was there, the army had capitulated, the government fled. What was missing was an organised party that could connect the struggle to the necessity to own, run and plan the economy by the working class for the working class, with entirely new systems of democracy, where every elected official has no special privilege and can be easily recalled, and transparency and accountability are the new norm. There's countless examples of the potential for socialist revolution being squandered or actively sabotaged by leadership. The examples of Allende in Chile and 1968 in France come to mind. The French workers had power in their hands. President de Gaulle famously informed the American ambassador, quote, "The game is up. In a few days the communists will be in power." And this was entirely possible if not for the so-called communist leadership. Currently, the ruling class is unable to resolve the crisis or relieve the pressures in society, yet the oppressed are unable to effectively organize against them. This is largely due to the state of the workers' organizations and its leaders. This is why building a genuinely socialist party is vital, to offer an alternative and to point the way forward. What is missing, above all, is clarity and revolutionary leadership. The role of Marxists and any serious socialists is to help organize and develop the growing class consciousness to its natural conclusion, socialism. The mistakes of the past aren't automatically learned. Without careful study of the mistakes, mass movements will almost certainly make the same mistakes over and over. This is why it's so vital we all dedicate ourselves to education. We are in an increasingly brutal class war. The enemy has highly practiced and class-conscious generals, whereas the working class has a distinct lack of notable leaders. In stark contrast, most of our leaders don't even understand we're in a class war, never mind how to win it. The oppressed are striving to find a way out of this nightmare. They try different parties and leaders, only to discard them one after another due to their inability to deliver. The most class-conscious are looking towards the ideas of socialism, yet what they mostly find are opportunists and reformists, who very occasionally mention the word socialism or Marx, but have no real belief the working class could ever take power or run society without capitalists. To use metaphor, when the army of the oppressed is ready to march, instead of leading the army to battle, reformists lead the working class away from confrontation and seek peaceful compromise at every turn. Then after some procrastination, despair and apologies, the army is led off a cliff. This is the harsh reality and consequence of the honest intentions of practical reformist politics. What reformist leaders want is compromise, crumbs, which in reality is a surrender to the ruling class. The only genuinely practical solution is to help prepare the working class to take power. The fate of humanity and the planet depends on it. Quote, "The mistake of the leaders lies in their position, in the fact that instead of clarifying the minds of the workers, they are befogging them. Instead of dispelling illusions, they are instilling them. Instead of freeing people from the capitalist influence, they are strengthening that influence." In summary, capitalism has reached its limits. The methods of stabilization available to the ruling class are diminishing, and any attempt to balance the books or oppress the public results in furthering revolutionary tensions and overall hatred of the system and anyone who upholds it. Capitalism creates its own gravediggers in many ways, in part by the development and speculation on technology like AI, which both crushes the worker through unemployment and alienating conditions, but is also a tool critical to our emancipation. Capitalism has indeed created the conditions, consciousness, and the technology for a socialist revolution. The leadership that's lacking, we must create ourselves. The current trajectory of capitalism is for a handful of corporations to control all resources and monopolize power. However, we are already seeing revolutionary tremors across the globe as class contradictions become untenable, including in Britain. Currently, the UK debt is 2.9 trillion, with the interest about 105 billion a year. This is about 300 million a day just on interest. This is completely unsustainable, and why implementing austerity is the focus of governments the world over, with global debt at a record 340 trillion. Poverty and inequality is increasing, as is the size of the working class as small business owners are increasingly squeezed out of the market. The trajectory is clear, and the crisis will only deepen overall. Our job is to prepare, to help catalyze and organize the realizations that flow from the crisis in order to finally break from it. So I'm going to finish with one final quick quote. No army can stop an idea whose time has come.